Thank you for joining us. Before we kick off, please join me in recognizing our DSW sponsors.
Hi, Denver Startup Week. I'm Ben Data, CEO of Food Maven and co-chair of Denver Startup Week, the largest free entrepreneurial event in the world, and it's only possible thanks to the support of our sponsors. We have nearly 40 sponsor companies who contribute to make DSW possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our title sponsors, Downtown Denver Partnership, JP Morgan Chase, Prologis, and Xero. Our track sponsors who have made all the great content you're hearing today possible: Battery 621 in the Public Works, Capital One Cafe, Colorado Lending Source, Friday Health, Quizlet, Exactly, Zayo, and Zestful. Our headline event sponsors are bringing you inspiration from around the country. Thank you to Wix, Kenzen, MAPR Agency, Obsidian HR, Kickstart Fund, Promontory Mortgage, Molson Coors, and Comcast. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors listed on the screen. Thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now let's get to it.
Quizlet is a global learning platform that provides engaging study tools to help people practice and master whatever they're learning. Every month, over 50 million people use Quizlet to study any subject imaginable, for school, work, or as part of their personal interests.
Quizlet is super efficient, and I often, walk to class with it on my phone or even just before I go to sleep.
Combining cognitive science and machine learning, Quizlet guides students through adaptive study activities to confidently reach their learning goals. Quizlet has over 200 employees across 3 offices in San Francisco, Denver, and London.
Being at the Denver Quizlet office for the last year has been pretty incredible. Seeing the office grow while maintaining its, core connections to our values. It's been an incredible experience to be a part of, seeing how humble, candid, and open everyone has been, and being part of a mission-driven company in a time of uncertainty has been incredibly rewarding. So I look forward to, what the future brings, because the last year has been a wonderful experience. Thank you, Quizlet.
Hey everyone, my name's Adam Bauman and I'm part of the Quizlet team here in Denver. I'm proud to work for a company that's goal is to help every single person on this earth become a better lifelong learner. One of my favorite things about working at Quizlet is how much we follow our company values. There's always learning opportunities. We encourage everybody to teach themselves something new, as well as help each other learn. Whether it's from art classes or lunch and learn talks on latest technologies, there's always something new to find and help yourself grow. And I really feel like that's one of the best things that any company can offer is growth and opportunity.
Thank you to our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. Also, a special shout out to Quizlet. They are our developer track sponsor, and we're hugely appreciative of their support this week. With that said, we're going to kick off this video session. Really excited about the content that Morgan and Shelley are going to share with us this afternoon. They're going to be available throughout the playing of the video for Q&A if you want to follow up in chat or in your Q&A interface in Zoom. And then they are also planning to stick around after for what sounds like some fun games and questions as well. So looking forward to the session, and thanks so much.
Hey everyone, hope your day of remote conferencing is going well so far. My name is Morgan, and thanks for coming to our talk about leading big projects.
Hi, my name is Shelley. I'm a web engineer at Quizlet. Have been at Quizlet for the last couple years on the activation team, which focuses on bringing new users onto Quizlet and making sure they have the best possible first Quizlet experience.
And I'm Morgan Steffi, as I mentioned before, and I've been an iOS engineer at Quizlet for 2 years now. I'm currently working on the re-engagement team, which focuses on bringing our users back, and I recently led my first large project as an EPL. So what is an EPL? Engineering project lead. I'll probably say EPL because it's shorter. It's not a role like a PM or an engineer that you would apply for and get hired for, but it's within engineering, and it's kind of a Quizlet, at least, it's a rotating role. So still in the individual contributor track, but with some added leadership. So it's basically the glue between the PM, the design team, and engineering, and you're the liaison for communication. So say you're at a company where this is a rotating role, but you have not raised your hand to sign up for it yet. Maybe you think it would be like too much work and not worth it, or you don't feel ready. But I've found it's actually has been great for my career. You learn a ton. Next, it's really rewarding. You're at the forefront of delivering. At Quizlet, the EPLs are like a voluntary role, so you sign up for projects you're interested in and excited about anyway. So that makes it really fun. Related to career growth, there's a lot of skill building, especially around leadership and communication. And then in this, since it's a different role, you're getting new perspective, which is, I think, very helpful moving forward as an EPL, or if you don't like the role and go back to never doing it again, you will probably be really helpful to all future EPLs because you'll understand what it's like. And like, even if now you're like, oh yeah, I probably wouldn't like it, it's very low commitment. It's only project based, so you might as well try it once. And lastly, I think you should do it because you probably can. I was really nervous for my first project, but with the help of my coworkers, I realized I was more prepared than I realized. And hopefully after this talk, you'll feel the same. So our plan today is to go over the 4 big steps of any project and sort of what the EPL does during each of those steps. And then at the end, we'll review core concepts that are hopefully like very familiar at that point. And that's the plan. So here's Shelly with our first step.
All right, thanks, Morgan. So this first phase that we're going to go through is the planning phase. Next slide. Okay, so step 1 is a really important step and often one that we tend to forget, and that is just to pause and take a deep breath. So you've just found out that you're going to be EPL for this new exciting project. You're probably feeling a lot of things. You're super excited, maybe a little bit overwhelmed, probably have more questions than answers, and yeah, lots of emotions. It's important to just pause and take a deep breath. I remember for me in December when I found out I would be leading an effort to build a referrals program at Quizlet where students can refer their friends, and if they sign up for Quizlet accounts, the referrers get some type of reward. And I found out in December I'd be leading this, and I felt all of those things. I felt excited, overwhelmed, and just tons and tons of questions. And I did not pause to take a deep breath, and it's something I really wish I would have done, because in that flurry of excitement, I kind of like agreed to a date of launch with my PM that I hadn't taken the time to go through and plan and see if it's actually realistic. And so in hindsight, pausing to get a clear head and get in a clear state of mind would have been a really helpful thing for that project. Okay, next slide. So now that you're in this super zen state of mind and you're ready to dive into the actual planning process, a great first step is to start organizing your thoughts in a doc. And this just provides a really great way to start organizing your thoughts and to create a list of all of the goals. Why are we building this project? What are the requirements? And just start getting things written down and clear. And having this doc as a single source of truth provides a great way to be able to share information with your teammates and allow your teammates to provide feedback and ask questions and raise concerns and really leverage that threaded discussion that's an option when you have a doc. So having those conversations in the doc is super helpful at this phase. For the referrals project I was just talking about, I remember this doc that we started together ended up being a 28-page doc, which was really crazy and overwhelming. And I would advise going much simpler than that. Like, being concise and clear is more important than recording just all the information you possibly could. Next slide. Okay, so now that you have things written down in some type of doc and have a clearer sense of why you're building what you're building and what you're building, the next step is to start writing out what tasks need to be done in order for this project to be completed. And it's okay if you don't know exactly the details of every single task and how it will be done, but just start writing major pieces at a high level that you know need to be completed. For the referrals project, this included things such as selecting a vendor, building out new landing pages for both the referrer and the newly referred Quizlet user. It also included building a new API endpoint for the native clients to support referrals. So yeah, just starting to write down all of the pieces, as many as you can think of at this phase, is super helpful. And wanted to call out not to forget that integrating and testing is another task. And it's one that we often forget, but it does take time, and it's important to include this as a task. So once you've written down at a high level all of the big things that need to be done to complete your project, start to sequence those tasks in a rough timeline and kind of like order them so you know that these big tasks need to be completed first, these next set needs to be completed after, and you should have your highest risk tasks to be earlier in the timeline, because those tend to be the ones that have the most uncertainty around them. So might be investigative tasks and have the potential to change the direction of the project a lot. For referrals, the highest risk task was definitely choosing the vendor, because once we chose the vendor, the implementation could vary drastically from that point. So once you've like roughly ordered these into which ones should be done first and later, the next step is to start assigning milestones that include dates, and make sure that you're being conservative, realistic, and that you feel good about those dates that you're assigning. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a rough milestones timeline that I put together for a teacher referrals program I led that we launched soon after the student referrals program. And you can kind of see how I was mapping things out on a week-by-week basis, listing together different kinds of tasks that need to be done by what date. And keep in mind, this is all rough and not set in stone. This was just my initial estimation of when I thought certain tasks could be completed by. And I also wanted to call out that I reserved about 3 weeks of time for integrating and testing, which I remember felt like a crazy amount of time when I was writing out this plan, but I received feedback that it's better to be more conservative with your dates, because unexpected things happen throughout projects, and it's important to keep that buffer in there. And I'm proud to report that we did actually launch on time this week of July 20th. And I attribute a lot of that success to taking the time to actually create this milestone plan. Next slide. Okay, so once everyone, once the doc is in place and you have this rough milestone plan, it's important to get everyone on your team aligned and make sure that everyone is clear on what is being built, who's on the team, why are we building this, and when we're targeting release. So referring back to that doc that you created as a source of truth, and making sure that there's no outstanding questions that haven't been addressed, talking through any final concerns. It's a really important thing to make sure that everyone is really aligned and on the same page before proceeding. And at Quizlet, something that we often do is we'll have project kickoff meetings for this stage, which are usually about 30 minutes, and it's just a space for everyone to get together and make sure that there's nothing outstanding and we're ready to begin building. Next slide. Okay, so now that you are officially kicking off the project, the next step is to begin creating tickets. And tickets are really just broken down units of work that engineers can pick up to begin implementing. And as you're writing these tickets out, you probably will realize that there are certain requirements that aren't quite as clear as you initially thought when you were creating the documentation. And that's totally okay and expected. And this is just a time to start getting clarity and asking questions and talking to stakeholders about what it is that we want to build so that we can begin building. And as you're asking questions and having these conversations, keep in mind that it's super helpful if you as an EPL are solution oriented. So rather than just proposing a list of options, suggesting a solution is super helpful. For the referrals project, one of the tickets I was writing out in the early phases of the project was to create a landing page for the referrer. And I realized we hadn't even talked at all about whether we wanted that landing page to be using CMS, which would allow marketing to be able to easily change content, such as copy and images. And so we just hadn't thought of that at all. But I did some upfront research to see how much engineering effort it would take to implement with CMS. Determined it was a little bit more complicated than I thought it would be. So I proposed a solution to the PM and said, like, hey, I think we shouldn't start right out of the gate with a CMS. We'll just build a regular static landing page. We talked it through. She agreed that was the right approach. I finished writing the ticket to include that detail that we're not supporting CMS out of the gate. And we're ready to start implementing. Okay, next slide. So another really important thing I wanted to call out is you don't need to do it all. Especially if you're leading a really large project, it's literally impossible to write every single ticket for the whole project at this phase. Unexpected things are going to come up, and if you spend a whole ton of time writing out detailed tickets up front, you probably are going to be wasting time because the plan might change later on. So just start by writing the most important tickets that need to be done first. And another call out is you can delegate at this stage. At EPL, as EPL, it's not 100% necessary that you write every single ticket. You have a team to lean on as well, and it can actually be beneficial for the project if other teammates are breaking down features into stories because they're bringing their own perspective to it and may see things that you don't see as the EPL. Okay, next slide. And this phase of the planning is also a very important phase, and it's to stop. It's really easy to start spinning into this loop of endless planning where you're trying to write out the perfect plan, and you definitely don't want to be in this mode where you're planning forever, because ultimately planning should be a rough process, shouldn't be perfect, and the sooner you can start building, the better that you're setting your project up for success. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to share an experience that I had as my first time as EPL at Quizlet. I was leading a project in which we were introducing topic pages to Quizlet, which is essentially these new pages where we're grouping content by category and then showcasing specific content, like for example, science. And yeah, this project, we started having discussions around it in September, and didn't kick off actual implementation until around April. So that's a really, really long time to be in planning mode. And a lot of the kinds of conversations we were having, we were really stuck in the details and trying to perfect things before starting. But ultimately, some of those conversations could have been happening in parallel as we were already planning. So some details include things like we weren't sure whether or not we wanted to hire a copywriter to have dynamic descriptions that were different per subject. But that kind of thing we could have added on after beginning implementation. And another thing I wanted to call out is I didn't know that planning out milestones was a really important step. So I didn't go through that process of creating any type of timeline. And I remember that made me feel so anxious and powerless every time the PM leading the project would say the day at which he was expecting us to launch. And it's like seared in my memory. It's July 31st. And I remember every time I heard July 31st, I would just feel like so much anxiety, but I had no idea how to sort of back up my fears. So in retrospect, going through the exercise of planning out the milestones would have been super helpful to be able to present the data as to this is what needs to be done and this is how long we'll need. Okay, next slide. So included this quote by Eisenhower, which is plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So it's okay if your plan is not perfect. Your plan shouldn't be perfect, but going through the process of planning is where you gain the most benefit. Okay, next slide. So to review, in this planning phase, it's really, really important at the beginning to pause and take a deep breath. Creating a doc with milestones is a super helpful first step. Making sure your whole team is aligned before starting to build, breaking down tasks into engineering tickets, and then also to stop planning and not spend too long in this phase. All right, now I'm going to pass it back off to Morgan to go through the build phase.
Thanks, Shelley. So you've done all of your planning to the best of your ability, and now it's time to start building. So step one is all of your tasks need owners. So, and when I say tasks, I mean like stories or any like units of work that you've figured out for the project. And so you've probably spent a bunch of time on this already with the planning phase, but it's a great idea to just ensure that everything has an owner so nothing slips through the cracks. Although, important to note, probably a lot of the tickets will change or like maybe get thrown out or new ones will be added because projects change a lot. But it's nice to just know like someone's keeping an eye on something at least until it's thrown out. And another important reminder is that you should not be the owner of all the tasks. As an engineer, as me being an engineer, I was used to just picking up tickets. And so it felt pretty weird to assign other people tickets. And I felt like, am I just being lazy? Will they be mad at me? But no, being an EPL is a ton of work. And that means you'll have less time to code. And your solution definitely shouldn't be working extra hours so you can do leadership and write all the code. There's tons of other engineers on your team to do engineering work, so share the work with them. Next up is, for the building phase, is setting up some communication channels. So as you're moving into this phase, you should expect unexpected things to occur. That's just to be a theme throughout all of this. Things change constantly. And the way you work with this is setting up communication channels so you can talk through issues as they arise and make decisions. So basically, yeah, as things are changing quickly, the key is to communicate them as they're happening, the changes. And a guiding principle I like to use is if I don't want to mention it, then I especially should be mentioning it to in meetings or to the PM or whoever. So if I feel a little behind, or the project is running behind, or like requirements are unclear, it's always way more worth it to mention it sooner than later. And the communication channels we like to use at Quizlet are first setting up a project-based Slack channel. So not the iOS team, not the re-engagement team, but just a channel dedicated specifically for this project that goes away when the project is over. And then secondly, we do weekly project syncs, and that includes the ICs, the engineers, and stakeholders like the PM, design, higher-ups, whoever's involved with the project. And this is a really great forum for tracking progress and discussing issues and blockers as they come up. Also sort of marking off milestones so everyone knows sort of where we are in the project. This is also a good chance to make sure stakeholders are reviewing and giving feedback throughout development, which is very agile, which is wonderful. We all like it, but I think it's worth calling out that it does take work on the engineer side and the stakeholder side. So just make sure you're like being intentional about making sure that's happening. And one thing we like to do at Quizlet is share screenshots as the features are completed with design. That way they can be in the loop and giving feedback sooner rather than later, because the last thing you want is, as your project is launching, having a designer say, wait, actually, can you do this? You want to do all of that way earlier. And in general, like, it is your job to be the point of contact for all these parties, but the way you're doing that is setting up these communication channels because it really, really helps to get everyone in the same room or Google Hangout to make sure you're on the same page. And next up is facilitating decisions. So really throughout this, the whole project as an EPL, you're going to be facilitating decisions, but I'll say particularly so during the building phase. Again, you're always expecting unexpected things to come up. So as they're coming up, your job is to not ignore them, but face them head on and balance trade-offs between engineering and product, and then drive decision-making. So EPLs who are solution-oriented are usually the most successful. And a sentence that was really helpful for me that someone just mentioned, like, you should be saying something like this when you're an EPL, is saying, I propose we simplify this feature because it'll allow us to keep our launch date and still launch a usable functional product. So really you're like facing reality, being realistic, not trying to be a hero and say like, everything's fine. Yeah, we could do all the features in half the time, or whatever your PM is suggesting. You're thinking about what is realistic from the engineering perspective to get done and communicating that to the rest of the team. And yeah, just to really emphasize that point, like, you are engineering's advocate during this process. So that might mean, rather than just saying, yeah, we can do everything, you propose cutting scope, saying we can't do all of this if we want to get to this launch date, or we can do all of this, but the launch date needs to be later. Just communicating early and often about everything, especially if things aren't going to plan, is really important. And if you're behind schedule, it's like not the end of the world. You haven't like failed at everything. It's just, as long as you share that sooner, then it's like pretty easy to shuffle priorities or move the date depending on the project. And all of that is so much better than waiting till like the day before launch and then being like, surprise, actually, it's not going to happen. So just talk sooner than later. And an example I have about communication is from my last project I was the EPL for, which was the Activity Center. And at Quizlet, that is the notification center we built that we previously didn't have. So that was exciting. The project went pretty smoothly. It launched on time. But during a retro meeting, which I highly recommend, the PM had some really good feedback for me. And she mentioned during the project, I rarely gave any strong suggestions. And it would have been really helpful if the EPL, if I was providing her with some more opinionated decisions. And so I thought about that, and I realized at almost every decision point, I came up with maybe 3 different solutions, which is great. You want to explore different solutions. But then I would say, like, here they are, like, you choose. Because I think I was, as just usually someone not being used to being EPL, I was used to the PM making all the decisions. And I kind of thought, like, I knew, like, the last decision I gave her was like 10 times the amount of engineering work, but I felt like I couldn't mention that because then I would like seem lazy or like I didn't want to do work. So I would just be like, I hope she doesn't choose it. But in hindsight, that was the most important piece of information I was supposed to be bringing to the table. As the EPL, I had the biggest insight into the amount of engineering work it would take to do a project. And the rest of my team, the PM, the designers, were all leaning on me to communicate that clearly so they could accurately make a good decision. All right, and then the last part of the build phase is integrating and testing. So once the project has been built, as Shelly mentioned, you hopefully budgeted like a nice chunk of time to be testing. You want to work with the QA team, or if you don't have QA, work with yourself to first write a test plan that covers all of the use cases, code paths, and different devices, everything you need to do to make sure it's not going to break for your users. But then a second step that is great to do to make time for is making sure it's easy for people to test the code. So our QA people, it's easy for them to get builds, it's easy for engineers to get builds, but like we realized when we wanted the designer to test something, or we wanted like a stakeholder to check it out, it was like kind of a bumpy road to get them a build. So it's really great if you can create like a link that gets them right to the correct build, or a link that auto sets all the A/B tests you need. Basically make it a simple process so they can access the product before it launches, because you really want their feedback. You should be getting their feedback before it launches, not afterwards. And then also, just to emphasize, like time-wise, all this should not happen the hour before launch. Like it should be half a sprint, multiple days, because say the testing even only takes one day, you want to have time to triage the bugs you find, and maybe not all of them are deal breakers. Maybe some you and the PM can determine like we can live without this and put it in the next release, but you'll want some time to fix some. So that's testing. And then just to review for the build section here, you want to be not doing all the coding by yourself. Share it with other engineers. You're going to be really busy doing other stuff. Set up clear communication channels. Lots of unexpected things will happen. That's very normal. Projects change, but it gets very confusing and terrible if you don't have a way to communicate. And as you're communicating, just make sure you're advocating for engineering and remembering that your role is bringing that perspective to the table. All right, and next up we have launch.
Great, thanks, Morgan. Next slide. So this phase, the launch phase, is a really exciting one. It's like the culmination of your work throughout this time leading the project. So yeah, the first step is really to spread the word and communicate the fact that you've launched. And I guess sort of a pre-step to this step is this shouldn't be a surprise to your teammates and the stakeholders. Ideally, you would have communicated pretty frequently the fact that you're going to be launching on X date at X time, so that there's a chance for them to provide feedback if there's anything they're worried about related to the launch. But just over communicating at this phase in the project is much better than under communicating. I know for the referrals project I was leading, I felt like a little bit of a broken record at times, because the week leading up to the launch, every single day, I would post to the Slack channel and tag relevant stakeholders and say something like, as a reminder, we're going to be launching on Monday to 10% of our student users. These are the riskiest areas. Please let me know if you have any concerns with this launch. But I did receive feedback that it was really appreciated, that over communication, because nobody was surprised when we went ahead and launched that following Monday. And yeah, I guess I want to reiterate that communicating what the risky areas are to stakeholders before launching and after launching as well is important, because they kind of like know what to be looking out for. All right, next slide. So now that you're launched, it's time to start monitoring errors. And something I wanted to call out is you as the EPL should definitely not feel like a failure if errors do pop up, especially for big projects. It's very unrealistic to expect that the launch is going to be totally smooth with no bugs or errors at all. That would be quite the feat. But the point is, you shouldn't view yourself as a failure if issues should come up. And really, to be the most successful APL, it's more about monitoring those errors and making sure that you're addressing them accordingly. So the highest impact ones, the most serious errors, should be addressed first. And with each error coming in, you should be making a conscious decision as to whether or not this is one that is a deal breaker or a showstopper, one that might result in you needing to roll back your feature. But it's really about just being vigilant at this phase right after launch, and seeing how each of the errors coming in should be addressed. Okay, next slide. So this is also a really important phase of the launch, is to make sure you're giving credit to your whole team and everyone who contributed to the project's success. Making sure that you're calling out specifically who went into the success of the project, specific wins, maybe going through a technical challenge that was especially difficult to overcome. And really the goal of this step is to make sure that everyone feels really proud of what's just happened and that you've launched this amazing thing that you've worked so hard at. And that public recognition goes a long way and is something that your team will certainly appreciate and look forward to the next time you're leading a project too. At Quizlet, something that I do is we have a changelog channel in Slack in which we announce our feature rollouts, and I always tag everyone on the team and like send public thanks to each of those individuals in that public channel. All right, next slide. So yes, this is a very important step as well, and that is to celebrate. You should feel so proud at this point. You've launched your feature, things went well, and you should take the time to enjoy this. Don't just jump into the next project and, or fixate on errors. Just take the moment to enjoy it, celebrate with your team. Maybe that might be going for a meal, maybe a virtual meal in these COVID times. But yeah, take the moment to celebrate and enjoy this. Okay, next slide. So just to recap on the launch phase, communication is key. So over communicating versus under communicating, definitely over communicate. Monitor errors after launch and address accordingly, and then give credit to your teammates. Okay, now I'm going to pass it back to Morgan to go through the post-launch phase.
Thanks, Shelly. So yay, celebrate. You launched your product. Very exciting. Most of the features can be wrapped up for most of your team now, but as EPL, it's great if you can do a few more things alongside of the PM during post-launch. First is sharing your learnings. During a project, like you always learn a ton, but it's very easy to just forget all of it. So as I mentioned a while ago, amazing if you can set up a retro meeting to kind of take a step back and look at what went well and what didn't. It's great, like if you tried a new process, maybe around assigning PRs and everything went smoothly, like jot that down. Or maybe you tried a new pattern and made more testable code. Amazing, you want to remember that. And then just as much as the things that worked well, you want to think about the things that didn't. So maybe you thought like, oh, we'll slip in a refactor with this new feature, and it like really bloated the scope of the code of the project. Or maybe like your EPL, like me, didn't make any strong recommendations, and letting them know helps them do better in the future. So basically a great time for feedback and reflecting on things you want to keep doing and things you want to change. And then who to tell? You have all these great learnings. What do you do with them? First, you want to like look inward, sort of towards engineering, especially if you created any new code or any new features. You want to build documentation or maybe do a short presentation to let your coworkers know and future you remember how to use this product. An example, going back to the activity center, the notification center that I built, almost as soon as that was out, I was getting requests from other engineers saying, hey, how can my pod get notifications in that center? And it was really helpful to have a document sent up that I could send out and say, hey, here's how you use it. This specific project had a lot of moving parts, so it's really helpful to have like a how to test section in there. So basically think about things that like they're fresh in your mind now and seem really obvious, but you know, a year from now, you probably will forget them. So write them down. And then sort of looking outwardly, you want to be talking to like your PM about any future risks that maybe you had, like some tech debt in the code. Make sure you're communicating things sort of like looking forward, and like maybe check in with the analyst, make sure your logging is going well. Basically, don't just like abandon the project. Make sure all the stuff you have in your head is getting out to the people who need to hear it. And all of this is really great. I mean, first for the company, if this is something you should do to make sure the project goes smoothly in the future, but it's also really great for career growth. It increases visibility, lets people know that like you were associated with this great project that launched. So don't miss out on this step. And then secondly, you want to sort of think for the future of this feature. You want to review any tasks that got bumped as like a second priority that didn't make it to the launch. Maybe your deadline came up sooner than you expected. Usually there's a few more things you can add back in. And then also make sure you leverage any data you have coming in. So say you have an A/B test and everybody is getting like a really good interaction, but then at one step everyone falls off and you realize the button is too small or something. There's usually like little things you can hypothesize about, like this would take almost no work and have a really high impact. So work with the PM to identify what those things are and potentially help lead them in the next few sprints. So to review, in this last stage of the project, post-launch, you want to be sharing what you learned, reflecting, writing it down, making sure none of that just gets lost and forgotten, and then determining what to do next. So at this point, the project is done. You've completed your project. So now we are at this part where we talk about our 3 big takeaways. That hopefully all of this should not be a surprise, and you've heard us say it a million times already during this presentation. First is Shelly.
Okay, so big takeaway number 1 is communicate, communicate, communicate. Like throughout the project as EPL, you should be communicating a ton, and that's with stakeholders and your teammates externally. And this is all about like asking tons of questions throughout, being transparent. So like Morgan was saying, especially the times when you don't want to share information is when it's most important to share the information. The classic example is if you're running a little bit behind schedule, it's important to share that information sooner rather than later so that you can adjust. And another piece that's important is to solicit feedback throughout the process. And that's from other teammates, from stakeholders, from design. So the more often that you're receiving feedback, the better you're setting your project up for success. All right, now passing back to Morgan.
Next up, we have being solution-oriented. So you want to be clearly presenting recommendations to the PM and the team. And it's totally okay if you collaborate with other engineers first. You don't have to have all the answers. It's great if you collaborate with the PM to make sure you're really building the right product. But at the end of the day, it's much better to come in with a strong proposal rather than presenting equal options. So you want to be saying things like, I think we should do X because of Y and Z. Building off of that, you want to be opinionated and have a strong perspective. Not say like, we should maybe do this one. But it's your job to analyze the various solutions and decide on the best one. And just, I feel like sometimes I'm like, well, how will I know? But you could talk to other engineers. And then when you're talking to the PM and the designer, remember that they don't have nearly as much engineering insight as you do, because you are an engineer and you are the engineering project lead. So they're really relying on the information that you know about the project. They're counting on you to bring that to the table as you're all working together to build or to choose the right decisions and path forward. And a reminder back to my story with the activity center. In that case, both me and the PM were waiting on each other to make the engineering decision, or we were both accounting. Yes. So, and it seems obvious because the role title is called engineering project lead. But I wanted to mention it because it's something I just somehow didn't think through. But as the engineering project lead, you want to be helping make the engineering decisions, and you want to be advocating for engineering in all of these conversations.
Okay, and lastly, it's important when you're leading a project to not feel like you have to do everything for the project. You have a whole team helping out, and you can lean on that team, and ultimately the project's going to be set up for more success if you empower your teammates and to really own pieces of the project. Another call out is project fast approaching. We suddenly realize like, oh no, there's so much to do. I better like work crazy hours. And it's really important as EPL to fight that instinct and really try to lead the project in a more sustainable fashion where you're communicating earlier on what's doable and what's not, cutting scope where needed, and just relying on your whole team to make the project a success. Definitely not just you. Okay, next slide. So we hope now you feel like you can lead a big project and stay sane. Next slide. Thank you so much for attending our talk. We really hope you got a lot out of this, and definitely ask us any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for listening. We're going to go ahead and play a quick game of Quizlet Live to review the concepts. So I'm going to share my screen real quickly. And you can join by either scanning this QR code, or I'll also link in the chat. Oops. Sorry, looking for the chat. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I'll just wait a minute or so to give people a chance to join.
And for those who maybe haven't used Quizlet, Quizlet Live is a tool teachers like to use to review content with their students. So we created a Quizlet set, which is like the things that people study on Quizlet. And then this game can be auto-generated from that.
And it's super fun. So if you're like debating whether it's worth it, just like trust me and join. Okay, awesome. I am going to go ahead and start it. Okay, and we're off. All right, it looks like we have a winner. Congratulations, Jen. Yeah, I guess with that, we'll open up for Q&A now. We hope that you learned a lot in this presentation. And so feel free to enter any questions you might have in the chat or the Q&A.
And I guess while people are thinking, we can go over the questions that were asked during the talk. The first one we got was from Dylan asking, why should EPLs have to commit to a release date ahead of time? And I would say it is like, as we mentioned in the talk, it changes often. So it maybe seems like why decide on one, but because you're working with other teams, I think it's a good idea to aim for something and then just be clearly communicating as it seems like it might change. Do you have anything else to add, Shelley?
Yeah, this is something that it feels really unnatural a lot of times. And I know that at least it felt really unnatural for me for really big projects to be able to have any idea what that date would be. And my instinct was always to just like refuse to give a date. But the reality is companies like require some level of high level planning. So it's important to be able to give ballpark estimates of how long a given project will take. And if, especially for companies that are building things for clients, it's usually even more important to be able to give realistic-ish estimates. So I think understanding the why helped me a lot to get past that mentality of like, I'm just going to refuse to give a date ever. And then I see that Adam asked a question as well about how we handle situations where product and engineering have strong differences in opinion. And I did want to call out that this is really normal and expected, and it's healthy if you're having these kind of discussions and there are agreements, like that should be expected. And it's really just about, as EPL, it's really about giving the information needed to whoever the ultimate decision maker is to be able to make the right decision. So kind of like what Morgan was talking about in the talk of, she presented options A, B, and C and was like really hoping the PM didn't select option C because it was like way more work. But just providing that information is super helpful, and then ultimately like they'll be the decision maker.
I think I would also add, building off of that, to be as data driven as possible. So if you can, rather than saying like, oh, we really don't want to build that, if you can say like, we don't want to build it because it will take 5 months, something like that can be helpful. And then from the PM side, maybe they can say like, well, we've done our estimates and we've like sized this project to be, you know, have this % of lift for one of our KPIs or something. So that could be a way to help navigate when people disagree. Because yeah, ultimately it's great if you're disagreeing, because hopefully that means you'll get to the best solution. A couple minutes. If there's any other questions?
Yeah, don't be shy. Your Quizlet shirt.
Cool. Well.
Oh wait, there's a couple more questions trickling in the Q&A. Someone wants your shirt.
I was like, Shelley, you've seen this shirt before.
No.
There was like a blog we had where you could buy shirts. but we might have to follow up on if that still exists. It was really hard to find.
Yeah, we'll follow up. Matt is asking, how do you handle unexpected changes to a product ask in the middle of development that may have significant engineering impact? So these are like these unexpected, in the middle of the project, suddenly the PM is like, oh, actually, can you also build this extra thing? Yeah, I guess, Morgan, did you want to take this?
Sure. Yeah, I think the more projects I do, the more I realize this is just, it happens all of the time. And to expect it, expect the unexpected. And then per the other thing we keep saying, just communicate that your job is to be sort of anticipating these things. And, you know, say a huge change comes up, just communicating the work that it will take to make sure everybody's on board with if it's worth taking on that change or not.
Yeah, I really like how you phrase that of like, this is normal and always expect the unexpected. And yeah, it's pretty rare that you won't have like unexpected asks in the middle. So just learning how to communicate what it means if you take it on, and like talking through trade-offs of, okay, like maybe we'll add this, but we might need to remove something else if we still want to hit our date. Mm-hmm. Okay, any last minute questions?
Oh, well, thanks so much for coming, everyone. It was great to do this talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. We hope you learned something. Thanks for coming.
Have a good one. See ya.